Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
I've got a story here sent to me by everybody. This is one of those stories where I started getting bombarded with these. People saying, Steve, check this out. Have you seen this? And I have seen it now. I've checked it out. But it's another case of something being sold in a store that the packaging description could be considered misleading by some people and is considered misleading by the people who filed a lawsuit regarding it. And this is a new one. Fireball Cinnamon is getting sued for selling mini bottles that don't actually contain whiskey. And the description does imply that it contains whiskey. And there's other factors that go into whether or not a person could reasonably think that these little bottles contain some form of whiskey. So a lawsuit's been filed. Like I said, a lot of people sent me. Thanks a lot. I'm going to go with the version from WJCL, which is Channel 22, ABC. And Danielle Harling wrote this. If you've ever walked into your local gas station and excitedly picked up one or even a handful of mini Fireball bottles, you might want to sit down for this news. And by the way, that's probably the start of many sad evenings. Pulling into the corner gas station and buying yourself a handful of mini Fireball bottles. But it turns out that the little bottles don't contain any whiskey whatsoever. Some of them don't. None. Like most gas station beverages moonlighting as cocktails or hard liquor, Fireball Cinnamon is actually a malt beverage, which of course does call to mind fine malt lyrics, but that's another story altogether. Food and Wine reports that the news was uncovered due to a class action lawsuit filed by a plaintiff seeking class certification, saying that she was misled along with countless other people. The lawsuit was filed against the Sazerac Company. Sazerac, and I could be mispronouncing that, but that's what it looks like to me. They are, of course, the makers of Fireball. It accuses the company of misleading customers with the labeling on the little bottles. So here's the breakdown. There's Fireball Cinnamon, and there's also Fireball Cinnamon Whiskey. The miniature bottles of both look quite similar. But how you tell them apart, one way is the label for the Fireball Cinnamon says, and this is the quote, malt beverage with natural whiskey and other flavors and caramel color. Additionally, the Fireball Cinnamon alcohol by volume, the ABV, stands at 16.5%, which is obviously much lower than Fireball Cinnamon Whiskey at 33%. And the tricky part actually breaks down to how a sentence is punctuated and phrased, because it says that it's a malt beverage with natural whiskey and other flavors. And the question is natural whiskey the word, or is it whiskey and other flavors, meaning that whiskey is a flavor? And that's where this argument starts. Using the words with natural whiskey and other flavors is a clever turn of phrase, because consumers who read this will not necessarily see how it says natural whiskey distinct from the other flavors. And so people think, oh, natural whiskey is one ingredient, but it also contains other flavors. When apparently they say, no, it's whiskey flavor and other flavors. Whiskey flavor. And that gets us back to the old vanilla argument, because there's been a lawsuit, several, filed on behalf of people who bought things that said vanilla, such and such. And you read the ingredients and it does not contain actual vanilla extract. And the question then becomes, if it just says vanilla, does that mean it necessarily does contain that, or it's flavored like that? Well, here they have the phrase that says with natural whiskey, and it's an ampersand, and other flavors. And so is the natural whiskey one thing while other flavors are something else, or is it whiskey and other flavors? They're apparently saying that whiskey here is simply a flavoring and not an actual description of the contents of the bottle. What the label means to say is that the product contains natural whiskey flavors and other flavors, but by not excluding the word flavors after natural whiskey, purchasers who look closely might expect a distilled spirit of whiskey was added as a separate ingredient, the lawsuit continues. Fireball has reportedly shot back, stating that the Fireball Cinnamon can be differentiated from its boozier counterpart by the words Fireball Cinnamon on the front label, without whiskey. So that's always the question, is number one, is the labeling accurate? Number two, is the labeling clear? And you might say, Steve, isn't clear accurate? Well, no, I can put something in the back of a product in micro print and say all kinds of stuff that most people aren't going to read. And so the question is, how apparent is this to somebody? But I will point out to you that in the law, there are often different standards to which you will be held. And it depends on what you are in relation to somebody else. So I've mentioned before that just as a member of society, you have a duty to drive your car in a safe manner. And if you do so negligently, that is, you drive your car negligently and you breach that duty to drive your car safely, someone gets injured, they can sue you for auto negligence injuries. And that's because you have that duty to somebody. The question is, what duties does a manufacturer of alcohol or food or whatever that's being sold for consumption in a retail setting, what duties do they owe the consumer? And so many of those duties are spelled out by things like the Federal Trade Commission or the Food and Drug Administration or some agency that says, here's what the labeling must include. You must tell people if it includes this or if it includes this. Labeling must be clear, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that I like to point out is that there are often consumer statutes in states that are modeled on a thing called the Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act, the UDTPA. And the UDTPA often says, depends on which states have adopted it and how, that not only is it wrong to confuse somebody in a transaction, a commercial transaction, it is also wrong to create a situation that causes the probability of confusion. And that language is there for two reasons. One of which is, if it simply said you cannot confuse a customer, then a person would have to come into court and go, I was confused. How confused were you? Bring in a psychiatrist and have them study the person. How confused were they? And you start getting into how do you measure confusion? What is confusion? Some of the average person or this actual person? And that's one of the distinctions. And so if we say that you can't confuse somebody, that's one thing. But if I say you can't cause the probability of confusion, means that we can look at the transaction and ask ourselves, would this probably confuse somebody? And if the answer to that is yes, and it's a consumer setting, and somebody's been harmed by this, there's a bunch of other stuff to this, but that might be a standard that's interesting to look at. So the question then becomes, when you write that it has natural whiskey and other flavors, will that confuse people into thinking that it contains whiskey? Because it says it contains natural whiskey. Well, no, it's whiskey and other flavors. And I think a lot of people are going to say, well, you know, I might not be confused by it. I might not even drink this Fireball stuff. I might not do my food and beverage buying at a local gas station either. But the point is that I think if you look at that would create the probability of confusion with respect to the average person. But you know something? There's a lot of these lawsuits been filed lately. I've not yet seen results on many of them, so I suspect they either settle or they just drag on forever. So if anything happens with this, I'm sure my audience will let me know, because I got probably 200 emails on this, and I got no problem with that. Keep them coming. If you see something in the news that you think I should know about, feel free to send it my way. I'll take a glance at it. So again, for those who are curious about the fine malt lyrics, Fireball Cinnamon is getting sued for selling mini bottles that don't actually contain whiskey, although they contain natural whiskey flavor. So there you go. Danielle Harling wrote it for WJCL 22 ABC. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. One can never know for sure what a deserted area looks like.